That's true. Naked Palpatine.
Oh, you pick that one. Fresh out of the clone tank, nude Palpatine is my
Well, that's the first thing I think of when you say Dark Empire Palpatine.
Hello everybody, and let us walk with rhythm. Today I have for you Paul of Dune by Brian Herbert, the son of Frank Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson, known for his Star Wars acclaim with the Jedi Academy trilogy and the young adult series Young Jedi Knights, along with being heavily in charge of many of the short story collections like Tales from Mos Eisley's Cantina, the Bounty Hunters one, and the Jabba's Palace one. So, also a big help to the Tales of the Jedi comics, but that's a whole thing there in the Star Wars expanding universe. I'm reading this because this takes place in between Dune and Dune Messiah. However, you can read Dune Messiah without having read this at all. This is not essential to your viewing order, but I'm trying to review these all in chronological order, so this would be placed here. I also have, at the time of recording this, I've seen Dune Part 2 by Denis Villeneuve, or however the fudge you say his name, because I'm really bad with pronunciations of things. And I thought it was phenomenal. Little changes were made that aren't exactly accurate to the book, but overall the theme and core of fear of any one leader, I felt was explicitly clear in the movie, as opposed to the book, where it's not. It's a little bit more subtle. Therefore, a lot of people were actually confused about that and were upset with Dune Messiah for clarifying what was always meant to be. But here we have Paul of Dune, which is an in-between story where half of it is set during the 12-year gap with the jihad, and what Paul was feeling during that time, what other characters were feeling during that time, what they were up to, whether that be Margot and Hazmir Fenring and their daughter Marie, who of course is Phaedrath's kid, what Irulan was feeling during this time, what Stilgar was feeling during this time, what Chani was feeling during this time, but especially what Paul was dealing with during this time. And it's all fascinating and actually quite good. I have not always been the biggest fan of the Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson works. Some of the highlights for me were the Legends of Dune trilogy by them, which takes place 10,000 years before the original novel, along with the Schools of Dune trilogy, which is about 80 years after the previous one I mentioned. And then the Houses of Dune trilogy was decent. It is way weaker than Frank Herbert's writing, but if you wanted more Leto Atreides before he dies in the original novel, you'd read those books. And then they recently made Princess of Dune, kind of in preparation for Dune Part 2, since Princess Irulan was going to be a part of it. And it was okay. Wasn't amazing. Was just fine. Nothing to write home about. And then the one trilogy that I absolutely disliked after the first book was the Caladan trilogy, I guess is what you would call it. Is the Duke of Caladan, the Lady of Caladan, and the Heir to Caladan. And those I thought were really weak. One thing that always trumped me, though, about when I read that most recent trilogy, which takes place like a year before the original novel somehow, is Leto Atreides would mention this War of Assassins, and I had no idea what he was talking about because Paul Atreides only comes into existence at the end of the Houses trilogy. But they talk about this thing that happened in between this time. And this is the book that actually shows that. So basically, one half of the novel is after the events of Dune. So if you just watch Dune Part 2, you could read this and go straight into that. And then the other half takes place when Paul was 12 years old, and there was this small in the grand scheme, War of Assassins, where they were trying to kill Leto and a couple other people, and they handled that. And that's probably the weakest part of the book for me. I mean, it's still interesting, but if you're not a fan of the Houses trilogy by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson, then you probably won't be a fan of this half of the novel. But overall, those are the two things that are really going on in this book. It's one half's a prequel, where it's dealing with when Paul was 12 years old, and so you get to see a little bit more of Leto Atreides, and I would say it's irrelevant, but it does kind of like contrast what we're seeing with Paul now. It's sort of a thing. If we get to see before his death, we see Leto in his prime and the decisions he would make in not the same circumstances, but similar sort of circumstances as compared to his son, now that he's gone on this religious jihad and become the Muad'Dib. And so I think it's actually quite a good book. I don't think I'd put it in the Legends of Dune tier, but I think I put it above the Houses trilogy for me personally. So it's one of the better books made by them. Now I know in the Dune fandom you very much have you have two camps. You have anything that's not Frank Herbert's work is blasphemy. How dare you read it? You're a piece of garbage. You hate good writing, and you should kill yourself and die. That's one half of the fandom there. The other half is, well, these are nowhere near Frank Herbert's work, but they are a lot of fun, and we think add to the universe. And that's where I land in, except for that most recent trilogy that I do agree, I just think is unnecessary and bad. But I have reviews of those if you want to see those. But that's overall the gist of those plot lines. I think it is a good transition piece. I mean, you don't need any of this to understand Dune Messiah. Dune Messiah was the second book written, of course, so all you need to understand Dune Messiah is Dune. But I think this does give you sort of a good transition piece where we get to see Paul in the moment having to make certain decisions and actions during the jihad, and where he differs from his father and the choices he has to make, as opposed to where we'll see him in Dune Messiah, where he already is the emperor of everything. So I think for that, I do think it is worth your time. Especially, I don't know if I would say read this after Dune. Maybe wait till after you've read Dune Messiah. I don't know. Because, of course, the intended way is just read Dune Messiah right after. But if you wanted to read something a bit less heavy, because, Frank Herbert's writing is very dense, very sophisticated. So if you wanted something a bit more accessible before you jump into Dune Messiah, and maybe you're not a fan of the books, and you just watched part 1 and part 2 of the Dune movies that just came out, I would recommend this book, and then you could jump into Dune Messiah, and I think you do yourself a pretty good service there. Especially because if they make another movie, it's going to be based on Dune Messiah. But overall, I think it was really good, and I would recommend it. But I'm getting to spoilers now, so if you don't want that, time for you to check out. Alrighty, so there's a lot of continuity with the Houses trilogy, which of course takes place like 30 years before the original novel, because Paul goes to Caladan to kind of go see his mother and stuff real quick, because she's kind of like in charge of Caladan right now. And there is a statue of Victor Atreides somewhere. Victor, and we learned in the Houses trilogy that originally Leto, before Jessica, was married to somebody else, and they did have a kid together. And that kid unfortunately died. And I think it actually makes a more powerful case for the love that he has for Paul, because Jessica saw his grief, saw him in the worst stages of his entire life, at the deepest lows. She helped rise him back up, helped bring his spirits back. And because of that, for her love for him, she gave him a son. And sure, we get that context regardless that she loved him, so she gave him a son. But knowing that he had one previously, and that shattered him, to then give him another one, I think adds a lot of weight to everything there. So that is an addition of an expanding of a universe, or expanding a story and making it more meaningful in retrospect. The jihad is raging all over the Imperium, all over the known galaxy. And they took over Catan, which is where, Shaddam lives, fairly easily, and Stilgar hates that. He misses the challenge. We learn that Lady Fenring, Margot, and Hasmir, and their daughter, Marie, which, there's a lot of bad stuff about Hasmir Fenring, but one thing that I appreciate about this book is that while he knows full well that Marie is not his child, it is Phaedrathus, he still absolutely raises her as his own, and does not care for the slightest bit that he's not blood related to her. That is his daughter. It's something redeeming about his character that I rather like, but they go to Tleilaxu, because he is done with Shaddam, because Shaddam If Shaddam had only listened to Hasmir more, they wouldn't be in the situation that they were in. But because Shaddam continually ignored everything about what Hasmir would advise him in, he got in the predicament that he was in. And again, that's another thing I love. Say what you will about the Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson works, but I mean, I haven't started Dune Messiah, but Hasmir was never. He was just kind of there. He was a character, helped build a world, but was nothing special. It's really only because of the Houses trilogy by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson that I really like Fenring as a character. I think they absolutely made this character somebody worth reading about. Besides just a guy that goes a lot. So I appreciate it a ton. And the Jihad, of course, is taking over everything. Everybody fears him, but Paul knows he needs allies. He can't just rule through fear. So that's what he tries to do. Gurney is on a mission for Paul, but he kills a Fremen who killed somebody who surrendered because he was bloodthirsty and claimed to do it in Paul's name, and that pissed off Gurney, so he killed him. We learn about a character named Blood. I don't think he exists in the original novel. I don't even think he existed in any of the previous prequel novels either. Not that I'm aware of or remember. But he did fight in the War of Assassins, and this is kind of where we get introduced to this character so we can jump back in time later on in the novel. But that's what he's just there to kind of bring that up, and then he becomes a character in the present and the past. Irulan and Paul also have some interesting discussions about rulership and how that should work. And this is going to happen a couple times, but we jump back in time to when Paul was 12. And we just get to see a bit of the past, We get to see that Leto Atreides was going to get married to someone on a cause. Which, again, I was reading the most recent trilogy of Caladan trilogy, The Duke of Caladan, which takes place a year before Dune, somehow. But anyway, he mentions this War of Assassins, and I was super confused. Like, did I miss a book? But it was this. It's talked about in here. So that happened in between the Houses trilogy and of Caladan trilogy. But yeah, he was gonna get married, but stuff happens. That doesn't happen because a certain character dies. But by the end of it, he realizes he should have never even attempted it in the first place, and he promises never to marry anyone again. So, but then we go back to the present. And Paul tries to remember, because so much is going on in his brain. He could see so much of the future. He could see all these winding paths, the golden path. We haven't heard that term yet. His son will talk about that more. I haven't even read that, but I know the golden path and that whole thing. So, but that is essentially also what Paul's dealing with here, is the golden path and what's the best course of action for humanity, because there's a dark future ahead that he's trying to help prepare for. So there's so much responsibility and thoughts going through his head, but he wants to remain human. He wants to remain who he is. So he tries to remember what his father taught him, that his grandfather taught his father, which was to always be with the common people, because it kind of helps keep you grounded and not look at them as chess pieces or pawns, but actual people that you're working for. So he tries to retain that in the early years of the Jihad by taking a sojourn. I like using that word because it pisses off people from Star Wars. But he goes away for a bit because he works secretly, because of course if people know who he is, then they're going to try to protect him religiously and fervently, and he won't actually get to experience it as normal people would. So he enlists in his own jihad army as just like a new Fremen recruit, and keeps on a down low who he is, so he could fight as his normal men would. He tries to join in the war so he could feel the blood on his hands and see that responsibility and that weight, and not because like Emperor Palpatine, let's say, in Star Wars, he's throwing his stormtroopers left and right, sending Vader. They're mostly getting their hands dirty. He's just kind of sitting back. Now he's pure evil, so this is a different story. But still, it's like, do I just send out men to do these things? And I look at it like a video game or like a board game where I'm making these moves, but I'm not actually witnessing it. He wants to witness it. He wants to see his men in action. He wants to be a part of that, so he can feel like I can still relate to these men. I understand what I'm making them sacrifice and all that, so I can remain human. So that's what he tries to do in a little bit. Once he's done with that, he eventually returns, to being in charge of everything. And he tries to be kind to Gurney. because Gurney was tortured by the Harkonnens. All of his family died when he was younger. We actually get to read about that in the Houses trilogy, which is phenomenal. It's not better than the Legends of Dune stuff. It's still cool to get to see the backstory and all these characters and all that. But Paul wants to be kind, so he grants him, he makes him be Baron of Gidi Prime, so that he can reform it and make it beautiful, make it something worth living on. But he doesn't think about the fact that he's kind of torturing Gurney by doing it. Gurney's going to do it. He's honor bound. He loves Paul. He's loyal to Paul. He's going to do it. But at the same time, he doesn't want to be there. Every day there is a reminder of his trauma. He doesn't want to be there. So even though Paul's trying to be kind, he's actually horribly making Gurney suffer. And the weight of responsibility. We kind of get a mirror image of the scene from Dune, where the spice machine starts to break down. And, in the original novel and in the movie, we see Leto could care less about the spice. We need to save those men. But Leto Atreides doesn't have the prescience, doesn't have the foresight, doesn't have thousands of different scenarios coursing through his brain. And ultimately, when Paul's faced with I need this spice, but also another important thing, especially for the next book, Chani's with me. I have a higher responsibility, and I'm not willing to risk Chani's life. So, he damns those men to death. But of course, he's the Muad'Dib, he's the Lisan al-Ghalib, so the men die, still fervently, in their last moments, praising God, praising Muad'Dib for leaving them to die. And there's moments like that is so powerful. And, it may be written more simplistically and all that, but it's still, the weight of that, the weight of responsibility on Paul's shoulders, you feel that in this book, And I'm sure the next book will do that a million times better because it's Frank Herbert, but still, at the same time, getting to see that direct analogy. Is it a little contrived that, the same sort of problem happens? It's not the same exact problem, but it's a similar enough problem where he has to save these men or leave them to die. And you get to see the direct dichotomy between him and his father. It's part of the reason why I would say that the prequel stuff is pointless, but it actually isn't, because it actually just shows a stark contrast between who Paul's becoming to what his father always was. Because his father is remarkably consistent, in who he is and the morals that he holds. But that's not Paul. So, I rather like that scene. We also learned that the Tleilaxu, this is also something Dune Messiah will talk about, but the Tleilaxu have been trying to make their own Kiswath Haderach. I also forgot to mention in the prequel section, we get reintroduced to Rombar. Again, this is another reason why it's heavily connected to the prequel trilogy, of the Houses trilogy, because Rombar was a friend of his in the entire trilogy, and several things happened I'm not going to discuss here, but Rombar was a big character in there. Irulan and Alia actually have a really interesting, I'm probably saying her name wrong, Alia Atreides. They have a really interesting discussion, actually. It's interesting to see Irulan interact with her, because, yeah, she's like an adult in a child's body, but at the same time, for Irulan, she has this unnatural, or I guess natural, instinctual, need to care for her, because she reminds her of her sisters and younger sisters, and it was just a nice little moment between them. Fenring and Margot are doing the dirty, and two things here. Marie, their daughter, watches. That was a little uncomfy. But she says, you told me, you guys taught me to be stealthy and to, be there but not have anybody notice. That's what I did. And they're like, yeah, but we didn't mean, watch us do stuff. That was a really weird scene. And I would say out of place, but then again, knowing what Frank Herbert's willing to write, not that far off. So, okay. But the biggest thing here, and I just thought I'd mention it just because, oof, so Fenring's doing the dirty, and he thinks back to his childhood. And apparently when he was 4, I don't know if I read it incorrectly or not, he either was or it was attempted and almost succeeded. But either way, he either was almost or was molested, and that was one of his first kills. I think it was the first kill when he was 4 was killing his would-be or is molester. I don't know if I'm making sense there, but yeah, it not very important to the overall story, but just kind of something thrown in there. I'm like, oh, I mean, I can understand why Hasmir's the way he is, considering if that happened to him at 4 years old. I mean, damn. I'm sorry, dude. But we also have no more tolerance. Paul had tried to allow other religions to kind of still exist, just as long as they weren't opposed to either including or just being tolerant of his growing religion. Kind of like, like the United States is supposed to be like you tolerate everything, don't necessarily have to ascribe to anything, but you tolerate it. But some stuff happens, and he says, "No more tolerance. You're dead. Bye bye. You follow me or you die." So that was crazy. And we learned about this Gula Kiswath Haderach that the Tailaxu are making, which is his name is Thallo. And then we jump back to the past, and we get to have Paul meet his grandmother, because in the trilogy, stuff happens with Leto's son and first son. Grandmother may or may not have been involved with that, but Leto does not murder her. He sends her in exile to live with what she's done. So she just kind of effed off. We never saw her again. But Paul got to meet her due to the War of Assassins and having to get away somewhere. Also, I'll mention this because my friend Brennan brought it up once that there was a contradiction to the entirety of Dune because Paul leaves to go to E-Cause once as a 12-year-old and never again for this marriage proposal thing. And yeah, it is, because clearly the intention of the original novel is he never ever left Caladan, but at the same time, like, E-Cause is a similar ecosystem and structure to Caladan, so it'd be like going from, like, Los Angeles to, like, I don't know, Arizona. Like, it wouldn't be that different, But, so, I still think Paul can be amazed at seeing Arrakis, which is almost entirely a desert planet in the original novel, if he went off planet once when he was 12. I mean, how much do you remember from when you were 12? Because I'll tell you, I can't remember, like, a damn thing about 12 years old. But it's a very minor change. But the one thing they try to be absolutely consistent on, people are trying to kill Paul when he's 12. And Paul fights people, but he never kills anybody. They always bail him out of that by having Duncan kill him, or something else happens, or by their own stupidity they fall off and die, or something. Paul never makes a killing blow. Why? Because in the original novel, the first time he killed a man was Jamas. So they keep that consistent, even though he does have some battles in this book when he's 12. So, for their small contradiction of leaving a planet, which is not really a contradiction, it's a retcon, because they specifically have people mention, like Irulan mentions, like, history not always being exactly accurate, but da-da-da-da-da-da. So it is an intentional retcon, more so than a contradiction. They acknowledge it. But as for the killing people thing, they remain insanely consistent with that, which is kind of funny. And back in the present, Marie, Fenring, and Thallo become friends. We also know that Thallo likes to cut himself, and he is an imperfect Kiswath Haderach. Then we get to the big grand plan of Thallo, which is to kill all of his clones and himself, and kill his best friend Marie, which he fails to do. I mean, he kills all the clones and he kills himself, but he fails to kill Marie. We also get some interesting prequel connections, because he says he has a little bit of a lot of things inside of him. Some of the things he mentions being a part of him is Gilbertus Albans, who was the first ever Mentat to ever exist, and that is a big reference to the Legends of Dune trilogy, by Kevin J. Anderson and Brian Herbert, along with Schools of Dune, where we get more stories with Gilbertus Alban as he starts the Mentat school. So that is a huge connection. They also mention Raphael Carino, who is another big character in the Legends of Dune trilogy. So they mentioned that stuff being inside of his brain and stuff. It is an amalgamation of all these different things. So it was just cool to have. It makes, those were good stories in themselves. I truly believe that Legends of Dune and Schools of Dune can stand alongside at least the original Frank Herbert work as something pretty on par, in my opinion, personally. Maybe that's stretching it a bit, but like pretty close. But getting to see it mentioned here this far into the timeline is just like kind of cool. It's like a nice little. We'll see how I feel about the sequels that they made, but that was just like, man, my time spent, well worth it. Like it's even getting referenced here. Like that was really, it was a cool little thing. It doesn't matter in the grand scheme, but it was meant to be this perfect person that embodies the best things of the best people that have ever existed in history. So, yeah, it was just cool. And lastly, Hasmia Fenring, Margot Robb, and Margot Fenring and Marie plant an assassination attempt on Paul. It, of course, does not work, of course, but they did try. And Elia, in retaliation, because she was trying to become friends with this lady, murders Marie, or Mary, or whatever. But she kills her. And Paul, trying to remain human, pulls his dad and does, you're both going to live in exile. You'll be forced to live with Shaddam, who I know you don't like, and live with what you've done. And I know you don't really feel bad about what you tried to do to me, but you now have to live with the fact that your daughter's dead. So you'll deal with that and go live with Hasmir forever, or with Shaddam forever. So that's what they get sent to do. Also explains why there's, why there's no Fade Rotha's kid in Dune Messiah. So that's about that. Overall, I really liked it. It's by no means, and it's not better than anything Frank Herbert wrote, but it's a solid book. I enjoyed it. It's a good little transition piece, especially if you haven't read the books before and you just watched the movies. You want to move on from there, you could do that. Of course, I'll say this, in the movie, Chani seems to bail on Paul, but in the book and stuff, she sticks around. She doesn't necessarily agree with everything, but she sticks around. She's also way more atheistic and a non-believer in the movie than she is in the books. So that's the only thing to keep in mind. But yeah, Chani's still around, Irulan's still around. The overall gist is still a thing if you get into this book after having just finished the second movie. Some other things to mention. If you wanted more stuff around the original Dune novel, just to mention real quick, there's a Dune comic called The Blood of the Sardaukar, which basically just humanizes one of the Sardaukar members, and it's a nice little moment. Basically, during the Battle of Arrakeen, he could have shot down Duncan Idaho, but he didn't. He let him drive off so he can, reunite with Paul and everything before he sacrifices himself there, which was essential. But, had that Sardaukar guy not done that, the story wouldn't have ended the way it did. So, it's thanks to the Sardaukar, trying to show some kindness that Duncan made it out of there. So, just a nice little story humanizing characters that weren't really humanized. Water of Keenly, basically we just get to see what Gurney Halleck was up to before he met up with Paul again in Dune. So that's some stuff to check out. They were okay comics, they were fine, nothing fantastic or anything. Never really thought Dune needed comic books, but they're decent little things if you want them. Just such little additions to the lore, and nothing spectacular or nothing. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Next time we talk about Dune, it will be the official sequel by Frank Herbert, Dune Messiah. Till next time, guys. Make sure to walk with rhythm, or the sandworms might eat you. And obey the Lisan al-Ghalib. Till next time.